The sky over the Ardennes was the color of old bruises that December morning in 1944, purple and gray and swollen with the promise of snow. Captain Heinrich Volker could taste metal on his tongue. Whether from fear or the recycled oxygen in his mask, he couldn't say. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 cut through the frigid air at 300 miles per hour. The Daimler-Benz engines roar a familiar thunder that had accompanied him through 47 combat missions. But this morning felt different. The air itself seemed to hum with wrongness. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Adler Squadron, maintain formation, he called into his radio, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gloved hands. Intel says the Americans are running low on fuel. Their fighters should be grounded. But Heinrich had learned not to trust intelligence reports. Not anymore. Not after the lies about invincibility, about wonder weapons, about certain victory that always seemed to retreat just beyond the horizon like a mirage in desert sand. He was 24 years old and felt ancient, a relic from a war that had already consumed the better part of his youth. The Knight's Cross at his throat, earned over the skies of Stalingrad 2 years prior, felt heavier each day, like a noose tightening slowly. Below them, the Ardennes forest stretched endlessly, a carpet of snow-draped pines that concealed the Wehrmacht's last desperate gamble. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the offensive the Americans would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. Somewhere down there, German tanks were grinding westward, trying to split the Allied armies and reach Antwerp. The entire operation depended on air superiority, on keeping American fighters grounded, on one more miracle in a war that had long since stopped producing them. Contact! 3 o'clock high. The call came from Lieutenant Oscar Brenner, barely 19, flying his first real combat mission. Heinrich's eyes snapped to the right, squinting against the weak winter sun that hung like a tarnished coin in the eastern sky. At first, he saw nothing but clouds and contrails. Then they emerged. They were wrong. Everything about them was wrong. American fighters, yes, but not the P-47 Thunderbolts or P-51 Mustangs he'd come to recognize and respect. These were something else entirely. Gull-winged monsters with noses that stretched forward like the beaks of predatory birds. Their silhouettes were unmistakable, alien, aggressive. Even from 3,000 meters away, Heinrich could see the distinctive inverted gull wings that gave them a shape unlike anything he'd encountered in European skies. Corsairs? Breathed his wingman, Hauptmann Ernst Adler, with something like reverence in his voice. F4U Corsairs. What are they doing here? The question hung in the frozen air. Corsairs were carrier-based fighters, Pacific theater aircraft designed to duel Japanese Zeros over tropical waters. They belonged in the Solomon Islands, over Guadalcanal, anywhere but here, over the frozen forests of Belgium. Yet here they were, a full squadron at least, their distinctive blue-gray paint schemes catching the pale sunlight as they banked toward the German formation. Heinrich's mind raced through calculations born of 2 years of aerial combat. The Corsairs' reputation preceded it, 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney engine producing over 2,000 horsepower, top speed of 415 miles per hour, rate of climb that exceeded 4,500 feet per minute. The Americans called it whistling death because of the sound its cowling made in a dive. The Japanese had another name for it, one that translated roughly to the most formidable fighter in the skies. But this was supposed to be Europe. This was supposed to be familiar territory, familiar opponents, familiar tactics. Adler Squadron, defensive circle now. Heinrich barked, already throwing his stick left, pulling his Messerschmitt into a hard turn that pressed him into his seat with 6 times the force of gravity. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. His oxygen mask felt like it was suffocating him. The 6 remaining aircraft of Adler Squadron, they'd started the war with 12, began the defensive maneuver they'd practiced 100 times. It was a sound tactic. Aircraft flying in a circle, each covering the tail of the fighter ahead, creating a ring of mutual protection that made it nearly impossible for an enemy to attack without exposing himself to defensive fire. Nearly impossible. The Corsairs didn't seem to care about impossible. They came in from above and ahead, not in the cautious, probing attacks Heinrich expected, but in a coordinated dive that spoke of absolute confidence. The lead Corsair, marked with the number 17 on its fuselage and what looked like a snarling tiger's mouth painted beneath the cowling, rolled inverted and plunged toward the German formation like a stooping hawk. Heinrich saw the muzzle flashes before he heard the guns. 6.50 caliber machine guns, all concentrated in the Corsair's wings, all firing in unison. The Americans favored this arrangement, putting all their firepower in the wings rather than firing through the propeller arc like German fighters. It meant their bullets converged at a specific distance, creating a cone of destruction that could shred an aircraft in seconds. Lieutenant Brenner never had a chance. The young pilot's Messerschmitt came apart like wet paper. Heinrich saw the canopy explode in a shower of plexiglass, saw the wing root rupture in a geyser of fuel and hydraulic fluid, saw the aircraft tumble sideways and begin its final spiral toward the forest below. There was no parachute. 19 years old, 3 sisters and a mother waiting in Dresden, and now just smoke and falling debris. "Break! Everyone break!" Heinrich shouted, abandoning the defensive circle, his tactical discipline shattering along with his formation. This wasn't a fight they could win through textbook maneuvers. This was survival. He threw his Messerschmitt into a split S, rolling inverted and pulling through into a vertical dive that made his vision narrow to a tunnel. The altimeter spun backward, 4,000 meters, 3,000, 2,000. The trees below resolved into individual pines, their snow-covered branches reaching up like fingers trying to drag him down. Corsair followed him down. Heinrich could see it in his mirror, that distinctive gull-wing shape growing larger, the pilot. He could see the pilot now, helmet and oxygen mask and the suggestion of eyes behind goggles, lining up his shot with methodical precision. No panic, no rushed firing. Just professional competence that was somehow more terrifying than aggression would have been. 1,000 meters. The trees were individual now. Heinrich could see a deer bounding through the snow, startled by the descending thunder of aircraft engines. He pulled back on the stick with both hands, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat, feeling his vision gray out at the edges, feeling something pop in his spine. The Messerschmitt shuddered, protested, but responded. The nose came up, 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 and he was racing along the treetops, snow flying up in his wake, branches snapping beneath his passage. The Corsair stayed with him. Of course it did. The American pilot wasn't some green replacement fresh from training. Heinrich could tell by the way the Corsair moved, the way it anticipated his maneuvers, the way it positioned itself not where Heinrich was but where he was going to be. This was someone who had fought before, who had killed before, who had reduced aerial combat to a series of geometry problems to be solved with bullets. "Ernst!" Heinrich called into his radio. "Ernst, where are you?" Static. Then, "On your 6, trying to shake 2 of them. There." The transmission cut off in a burst of static and what might have been an explosion. Heinrich's world compressed to the present moment, to the stick in his hands and the rudder beneath his feet, to the engine's roar and the wind's scream and the Corsair's machine guns starting to fire again. Tracers arced past his canopy, lazy-looking lines of fire that were actually traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. One punctured his left wing, leaving a hole the size of a dinner plate. His aircraft shuddered but held together. He jammed the throttle forward, coaxing every last bit of speed from his Daimler-Benz engine, and pulled up into a climbing turn. The Messerschmitt excelled at climbing. It was one of the few advantages he had. But as he pulled up, watching his airspeed bleed off, watching his altitude increase, he saw something that made his blood freeze. The Corsair was climbing faster. It wasn't possible. It violated everything he knew about aircraft performance, about wing loading and power-to-weight ratios. But there it was, the blue-gray fighter matching his climb degree for degree and then exceeding it, positioning itself above him, preparing to dive and attack from the position of maximum advantage. Heinrich understood in that moment that he was going to die. Not eventually, not in some future battle, but here, now, in the next 30 seconds. The realization was strangely calming. He thought of his sister, Anna, who wrote him letters every week filled with details about her nursing work in Hamburg. He thought of his father, who had flown in the First War and who had told Heinrich, when he'd announced his intention to join the Luftwaffe, Flying is the closest thing to freedom a man can know. Dying in the sky is the closest thing to grace. He hoped his father was right. The Corsair rolled over and dove. Heinrich pushed his stick forward, diving again, accepting that he couldn't outclimb his pursuer and hoping he could perhaps outdive him. The forest rushed up again, a green-white blur that filled his windscreen. His airspeed indicator climbed, 400 kilometers per hour, 450, 500. The aircraft began to shake, the airframe protesting speeds it hadn't been designed to sustain. And then, impossibly, a second Messerschmitt flashed past his canopy. Its guns blazing, tracers reaching up toward the diving Corsair like fingers of fire. "I've got him, Heinrich." It was Ernst's voice, strained but alive. Brake right now." Heinrich yanked the stick right, pulling so hard he felt something tear in his shoulder, and his Messerschmitt rolled away just as the Corsair opened fire on the space where he'd been a second before. Ernst's bullets forced the American to pull up early, to abort his attack run, to give Heinrich the seconds he needed to gain separation. "Reform on me," Heinrich gasped into his radio, pulling back to level flight at 200 meters, barely above the trees. "Anyone who's still alive, reform on me." The radio crackled with responses. Ernst was there. So was Hauptmann Gerhard Müller, 41 years old, father of 3, veteran of Poland and France and Russia. And Feldwebel Otto Zimmermann, 26, former philosophy student who quoted Nietzsche between missions and kept a worn copy of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in his flight jacket. For out of 6, in 3 minutes of combat, they'd lost 2 pilots and accomplished nothing. Heinrich turned south, toward their base at St. Vith, keeping low, using the terrain to mask their escape. Behind them, the Corsairs circled like satisfied predators, not pursuing. Why would they? They'd made their point. They'd announced their presence. They'd shown that the sky over Europe was no longer Germany's to command. The debriefing room at St. Vith smelled of cigarette smoke and desperation. It had once been a Belgian schoolhouse, and the walls still bore faint chalk marks where children had practiced their arithmetic before the war had come and transformed their classroom into a space where men calculated the mathematics of death. Heinrich sat at a wooden desk scarred with carved initials. PD 1938. Someone had etched into the wood. Perhaps a student who'd grown up and was now fighting or dead or hiding or fled. Major Klaus Richter stood at the front of the room, his uniform immaculate despite the general deterioration of everything around them. He was 52, old for a combat officer, with gray threading through his clothes, cropped hair and lines around his eyes that had been carved by too many losses, too many letters to grieving families, too many promises broken by circumstance and fate. "Corsairs," Richter said, the word hanging in the air like an accusation. "Someone want to explain to me how American naval fighters ended up over Belgium?" Heinrich cleared his throat. His shoulder still ached from the violent maneuver that had saved his life. "Sir, we encountered a full squadron. At least 12 aircraft, possibly more. They attacked from altitude with coordinated tactics. They knew exactly what they were doing. And you lost 2 pilots in 3 minutes." "Yes, sir." Richter was silent for a moment, studying a map of the region that was pinned to the wall behind him. Red pins marked German positions. Blue pins marked Allied positions. There were far more blue pins than red ones, a visual representation of everything that was going wrong. "The Americans are supposed to be grounded," Richter said finally. "Weather, fuel shortages. That's what intelligence told us. That's what we based this entire offensive on, air superiority through enemy inaction." Ernst leaned forward from where he sat beside Heinrich. At 31, he was the oldest pilot in the squadron, a former commercial pilot who'd flown mail routes before the war. He had a wife in Munich and a daughter he'd never met, born while he was stationed in Norway. His hands, Heinrich noticed, were shaking slightly. "Intelligence is wrong, sir," Ernst said quietly. "The Americans aren't grounded, and they're not flying what we expected." "Tell me about these Corsairs," Richter ordered. Heinrich closed his eyes, reconstructing the engagement in his mind. "Faster than us in level flight, better rate of climb, better dive speed, heavily armed 6.50 caliber machine guns. The pilots knew what they were doing. No mistakes, no hesitation. They attacked like they'd done it 1,000 times before. They probably have, Gerhard Müller added. His voice was rough, damaged by years of shouting over engine noise. Corsairs have been fighting in the Pacific for 2 years. If they're here, they sent their best. Richter walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered airfield where their remaining aircraft sat like wounded birds. We can't afford to lose pilots at this rate. The offensive needs air cover. Our tanks are sitting ducks without us. Sir, Heinrich said carefully. With respect, we're sitting ducks with or without the tanks. The Corsair is a superior aircraft. The Americans have more of them. They have more pilots. They have more fuel. They have more everything. The room went very quiet. It was one thing to think such thoughts. It was quite another to say them aloud. Richter turned slowly from the window. Captain Volker, are you suggesting we can't win? Heinrich met his commanding officer's eyes. I'm suggesting that we can't win in the air. Not against Corsairs. Not with the resources we have. For a moment, Heinrich thought Richter might order his arrest. Defeatist talk was punishable by death, and there were SS officers at every base now, watching for signs of wavering loyalty, for any crack in the facade of inevitable victory. But Richter just sighed, suddenly looking all of his 52 years. You're right, of course, but we don't have the luxury of being right. We have orders. Tomorrow morning, 0700 hours, we escort the bombers to Bastogne. The Americans have reinforcements moving up from the south. We're to disrupt their supply lines. And if we encounter more Corsairs? Otto Zimmermann asked. Then you do your duty, Richter said. Like you've always done. Dismissed. The pilots filed out of the debriefing room in silence. Outside, the winter evening was settling in, the temperature dropping, the snow beginning to fall again in lazy spirals. Heinrich tilted his head back and let the flakes land on his face. Cold kisses that melted instantly against his skin. We're going to die, Ernst said quietly, standing beside him. Probably. My daughter is 9 months old. I've never held her. Never even seen her except in photographs. Heinrich didn't know what to say to that. What comfort could words offer against that kind of emptiness? They walked across the airfield toward the pilot's quarters, another requisitioned building that had once been someone's home. The ground crew was working on the Messerschmitts by lamplight, patching bullet holes, replacing damaged components, trying to keep aging machines flying just one more day, one more mission, one more impossible task. Heinrich's Messerschmitt, number 7, marked with 7 small black crosses for his 7 confirmed kills, had a new hole in its left wing from that morning's engagement. A young mechanic, probably 17, was riveting a metal patch over the damage, his breath steaming in the cold air. How bad is it? Heinrich asked. The mechanic looked up, recognized the pilot, and straightened. Not too bad, Herr Hauptmann. Should be ready by morning. Though I'm more worried about the engine. It's due for an overhaul, but we don't have the parts. I've got it running on hope and wire at this point. Heinrich clapped the young man on the shoulder. Hope and wire have gotten us this far. In the pilot's quarters, the surviving members of Adler Squadron gathered around a wood stove that provided insufficient heat against the December cold. Someone had procured a bottle of French cognac. Heinrich didn't ask from where, and they passed it around, each man taking a pull, the alcohol providing warmth that the stove couldn't. Otto Zimmermann pulled out his worn copy of Nietzsche and read aloud, his voice soft. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. What's your why, Otto? Gerhard Müller asked. Otto was quiet for a long moment. I used to think it was Germany, defending the fatherland, protecting our people. But now, I don't know. Maybe it's just you bastards. Making sure you don't die alone up there. They drank to that because what else could they do? Heinrich lay in his bunk that night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. Through the cracked window, he could hear the distant rumble of artillery. The ground offensive grinding forward, German tanks and infantry trying to punch through American lines through sheer desperate momentum. How many men were dying out there right now? How many last thoughts, last prayers, last moments of terror before the darkness? He thought about the Corsair pilot who'd nearly killed him. What was that man's name? Where was he from? Did he have a sister who wrote him letters? Did he think about the men he killed, or had he learned to reduce them to targets, to problems to be solved, to obstacles to be removed? War demanded that you see your enemy as less than human. It was the only way to kill without going mad. But Heinrich had never mastered that particular skill. Every aircraft he'd shot down, he'd imagined the pilot inside. Someone's son, someone's brother, someone who'd laughed and loved and dreamed before being reduced to smoke and debris. 7 kills. The Knight's Cross at his throat, and he still saw their faces in his dreams. He finally slept near dawn, and dreamed of gull-winged monsters with tiger mouths that breathed fire and death. The morning of December 23rd broke clear and cold, the kind of weather that pilots both loved and feared. Visibility was unlimited. The sky a hard, crystalline blue that offered nowhere to hide. Perfect flying weather. Perfect killing weather. Heinrich stood by his Messerschmitt at 0645 hours, watching the ground crew make their final preparations. His aircraft had been patched, fueled, and armed with what ammunition remained. The young mechanic, Heinrich had learned his name was Franz, from a village near Stuttgart, gave him a thumbs up. "She'll fly, sir. Maybe not pretty, but she'll fly." The mission briefing had been brief and grim. 6 Messerschmitts from Adler Squadron would escort 4 Junkers Ju-88 medium bombers to Bastogne, where American forces were dug in and resisting the German advance. The bombers would attack supply convoys on the roads south of the town. The fighters would protect them from whatever the Americans sent up. Everyone knew what the Americans would send up. Major Richter appeared as the pilots were conducting their pre-flight checks. He walked from aircraft to aircraft, speaking quietly with each pilot, offering words of encouragement that rang hollow in the cold air. When he reached Heinrich, he paused. "You're a good pilot, Volker. One of the best I've served with." "Thank you, sir. That's not a compliment. It's an observation." Richter's eyes were bloodshot, suggesting he'd slept as poorly as Heinrich had. Good pilots survive by knowing when to fight and when to run. Today, if you encounter Corsairs, you run. You protect the bombers as long as you can, but when it becomes impossible, you save your pilots. Understand. Heinrich understood that Richter was giving him permission to do what regulations forbade, to abandon the mission in favor of survival. It was an act of compassion that could get them both shot if anyone reported it. "I understand, sir." At 0700 hours precisely, the formation took off. The bombers went first, lumbering into the sky with their loads of high explosive, followed by the Messerschmitts in pairs. Heinrich flew with Ernst on his wing. Gerhard Müller led the second element with Otto Zimmermann. The third element consisted of 2 new pilots who'd arrived the previous evening, Lieutenant Stefan Weber and Feldwebel Kurt Schiller, both fresh from training, both looking terrified and trying not to show it. The formation climbed to 4,000 meters and turned southwest toward Bastogne. Below them, the Belgian countryside was a patchwork of white fields and dark forests, looking peaceful and pastoral despite the war that raged across it. Heinrich could see the tracks of tanks in the snow, dark lines that carved through the landscape like scars. They'd been in the air for 20 minutes when the radio crackled. Multiple contacts, 12 o'clock high, Angels 15. Heinrich's eyes snapped forward and up. There they were, silhouetted against the blue sky like birds of prey. Corsairs. At least 8, possibly more, circling at 5,000 meters, waiting. "Adler Squadron, maintain formation," Heinrich ordered, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his stomach. "Stay with the bombers." The Corsairs began their descent. They came in pairs, diving from altitude with their characteristic whistle, the sound that had earned them their Pacific nickname. The lead pair targeted the bombers, their .50 caliber guns opening up at long range, tracers arcing down like falling stars. "Break and engage," Heinrich called, abandoning his earlier caution. They couldn't let the bombers be slaughtered without resistance. He pulled up hard, climbing to meet the diving Corsairs, his engine screaming in protest. Ernst stayed glued to his wing, the 2 Messerschmitts rising together like dancers in some deadly ballet. The lead Corsair, number 17 again, the one with the tiger mouth, adjusted its dive to meet them. Heinrich opened fire at 800 meters, too far for accuracy but hoping to disrupt the Americans' aim. His 20mm cannon and machine guns chattered, sending lines of fire toward the diving Corsair. Most of his bullets went wide, but a few struck home, sparking off the Corsair's armored cowling without causing visible damage. The Corsair didn't even flinch. It bored in, closing the distance, its 6 guns hammering. Heinrich saw the muzzle flashes, saw the tracers reaching toward him, and threw his Messerschmitt into a barrel roll that brought him out below and to the left of his attacker. Ernst fired as the Corsair flashed past, his bullets stitching a line across the American's tail section. "Got him!" Ernst shouted. "I got hits!" But the Corsair didn't fall. It pulled out of its dive, climbing again with that impossible rate of climb, apparently undamaged. Heinrich caught a glimpse of the pilot, or thought he did, a figure in the cockpit, calm and professional, already setting up for another attack. The sky erupted into chaos. Corsairs and Messerschmitts twisted and turned in 3 dimensions, each pilot trying to position himself on an enemy's tail while avoiding the same fate. The air filled with tracers, with the stutter of machine guns, with the scream of engines pushed past their limits. Below them, the Junkers bombers pressed on toward their target, defenseless now, exposed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. A Corsair flashed across Heinrich's nose, pursued by Otto Zimmermann's Messerschmitt. Otto was firing continuously, his tracers chasing the American fighter but never quite connecting. The Corsair rolled, dove, and came up behind Otto in a maneuver so fluid it looked choreographed. Heinrich shouted a warning into his radio, but he was too far away to help, too committed to his own desperate maneuvering to assist. The Corsair's guns spoke once, a brief burst that couldn't have lasted more than 2 seconds. Otto's Messerschmitt staggered in the air as if it had struck an invisible wall. The canopy shattered. The engine began streaming black smoke. Otto's voice came over the radio, calm despite everything. "I'm hit. Engine's dead. Going to try to make it back." His aircraft fell away from the fight, gliding eastward with its propeller windmilling uselessly, trailing smoke like a funeral shroud. Heinrich's world compressed to a tunnel of desperate focus. Track the enemy. Lead the target. Fire. Mississippi track again. His ammunition counter wound down. 300 rounds, 200, 100. Each burst had to count, but counting meant hesitation, and hesitation meant death. A Junkers bomber exploded below them, struck by cannon fire from one of the Corsairs. The big aircraft came apart in a ball of orange flame and black smoke, pieces of it tumbling earthward like leaves in a storm. For men dead in an instant. For more names for the casualty lists. "We can't hold them." Gerhard Mueller's voice over the radio, ragged with strain. "There's too many." He was right. The Corsairs outnumbered them 2-1, and they fought with the kind of tactical coordination that spoke of months of combat experience. They worked in pairs, one attacking while the other covered, rotating through attack runs with mechanical efficiency. The Germans fought with courage and skill, but courage and skill weren't enough against superior numbers and superior aircraft. Another Messerschmitt fell, trailing fire. Heinrich didn't see who it was, didn't have time to check, could only register the loss as a distant tragedy competing with immediate threats for his attention. "Adler Squadron, disengage," Heinrich ordered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "All aircraft, disengage and return to base." The Messerschmitts broke off, diving away from the fight, using their superior dive speed to gain separation from the Corsairs. The Americans didn't pursue. They'd accomplished their mission. The German bombers were scattered or destroyed, the fighter escort broken. There was no need to chase individual fighters across Belgium when the objective had been achieved. Heinrich pulled out of his dive at 200 meters, barely above the treetops, his engine coughing and missing. Warning lights flashed on his instrument panel, oil pressure dropping, coolant temperature rising. His aircraft was dying, its engine damaged by combat stress or perhaps a hit he hadn't even registered in the chaos. "Ernst, you with me?" he called. "Here, Captain. My aircraft took some hits, but she's still flying." Gerhard? Stefan? Kurt? Silence from the new pilots. Gerhard Mueller's voice came through, faint and static-filled. Stefan and Kurt are gone. I saw them go down. So they'd lost 4 pilots and 4 bombers in less than 15 minutes. And accomplished nothing. Heinrich nursed his dying Messerschmitt back toward St. Vith, watching the temperature gauge climb into the red, listening to the engine's death rattle. Smoke began streaming from the cowling, thin at first, then thicker. He wasn't going to make it back to base. I'm going to have to put her down, he told Ernst. Find a field and belly in. I'll stay with you. Negative. Get back to base. Someone needs to report what happened. Heinrich spotted a snow-covered meadow ahead, relatively flat, no obvious obstacles. It would have to do. He cut the engine before it could seize completely, hearing the sudden silence as the propeller stopped, replaced by the whistle of wind over his canopy. The Messerschmitt became a glider, graceful in death, settling toward the earth with quiet dignity. He touched down in the snow, the aircraft's belly scraping across frozen ground with a sound like tearing metal. The world spun once, twice, and then he was stopped, tilted at an angle, the smell of hot metal and spilled fuel filling his nostrils. Heinrich sat in the silence for a moment, taking inventory. He was alive. His aircraft was not. Somewhere overhead, Ernst was flying back to report another disaster. And the war ground on, indifferent to individual fates. He climbed out of the cockpit and stood in the snow, watching his Messerschmitt settle into its final resting place. Number 7, marked with 7 kills, now just scrap metal that would rust and be forgotten once the war moved on. In the distance, he heard the sound of engines. American engines. A jeep appeared at the edge of the meadow, olive drab against the white snow, a white star painted on its hood. 2 soldiers in the front seats, rifles visible. Heinrich raised his hands, his service pistol still holstered at his belt, but his intent clear. The war was over for him. The Corsairs had won.